Hello, welcome to day 254. I have quite a bit to cover today, so I'm just going to jump right in because I don't want this to be any longer than it needs to be. This week we started reading in NTI, chapter 19 with verses 23 to 41. And this is where NTI is in a very basic way, not a super detailed way, but in a very basic way, helping us to recognize the difference between egoic reasoning and right reasoning. Right reasoning, of course, is that which points to truth. And as you know, our walkabout practices right now are about looking at the reasoning in our mind, determining if it is egoic or right reasoning, and then kind of asking, well, what do I want? Do I want to follow right reasoning or do I want to follow egoic reasoning, right? And so in order to do that, you have to know the difference between the two. The good news is, regardless of what it's saying, even when it's acting spiritual, the ego is always the ego. And so when you get to know what I call the fingerprint of the ego, it can't fool you anymore. Likewise, right reason or spirit is always right reason, always spirit. It in no way resembles the ego when you get to know them, because it also has its own fingerprint. So all you really need to know is the fingerprint of each. And then regardless of what is going on, you can have very clear discernment about whether that's egoic reasoning or right reasoning going on in your mind right then. And then you can make the choice you want to make. So starting with Acts chapter 19, verses 23 to 41, let's look at what egoic reasoning is. Within you, there is a reason that knows, and there is another reason that does not know. Of course, the one that knows truth. That's right reason. The one that does not know but thinks it knows is the ego. I will teach you the characteristics of the ego's reasoning, and I will teach you the characteristics of Holy Spirit's right reason. This will help you to recognize each in your mind. Then you may choose to pick one and to dismiss the other as meaningless. The ego's reasoning is based on desire to protect individual self-will. So that's something you can watch for. When the mind is thinking, trying to figure out what is the best decision for me, what is the best outcome for me, or it could also be mine, my kids, my family, my workplace, my country, because those are all extensions of me. But when it's struggling, trying to figure out what's best for me or mine from my point of view, that's the ego. And if you look for that, you're going to notice almost all of the thinking is self-will. You'll be able to see that very easily. You'll see that the ego is always thinking about me, my point of view, mine, what I want, the best outcome for me. That's just what it does. So the ego's reasoning is based on a desire to protect individual self-will. The ego's reasoning sees division and expects attack. You may notice stories in your mind about someone else judging you, what other people think of you, what the boss is going to say when you have that meeting next week. And if you really look at these types of thoughts in the mind, you're going to notice the ego is always expecting attack. So when you're listening to those stories in the mind, you are listening to the ego. And again, remember, you can always choose to see the ego as meaningless, which means the stories would then have no impact. But if you believe them, they have a lot of impact. They can cause stress, fear, anger. They can cause you to attack back, attack first, avoid. So the ego's reasoning sees division. There's a me and a them, a me and a him, a me and a her. and it expects attack. As a result, the ego engages in defense. And again, that could be you trying to attack first, or attack louder, or attack harder, or avoid, or lie, or manipulate, or control. There's all kinds of forms of defense to try and save yourself from the attack that you are expecting when you are listening to and identifying with the egoic voice. The ego is driven by fear, guilt, and unworthiness, so that it reasons itself into behaviors based solely upon these unconscious beliefs. So, for example, you might call a friend and invite them out to dinner out of guilt, because you're feeling guilty because you haven't seen this friend in a while. And again, you got this rule in your head that says to be a good friend, you should see them every so often. And so out of guilt, out of the ego, you're making the phone call and inviting them to dinner. Or out of unworthiness, you can do things like get angry when someone points out a mistake that you made. Everybody makes mistakes. But if you think this is proof that you're unworthy, you might get angry. You might snap back. Out of fear, you might avoid different situations, different people. You might try and control things, again, to the outcome that you think you need. But if you look underneath why you're doing the things that you're doing, and if you find that fear, guilt, or unworthiness is at the foundation of why you're doing what you're doing, then you're being driven by ego. You're being that puppet. You're being that robot. You're coming from deficiency cognition. So the ego is driven by fear, guilt, and unworthiness, so that it reasons itself into behaviors based solely upon these unconscious beliefs. Another good type of fear that you might find is fear that people aren't going to like you, or that your spouse isn't going to love you. People aren't going to approve of you if you don't behave in a certain way. Those are all egoic thoughts. The ego is seldom aware of the underlying beliefs that seem to drive all of its reactions and everything it does. This is why you must slow down and ask yourself, why? Why am I returning this phone call? Why am I inviting this person out to eat? Why am I working these late hours? Why am I mowing the lawn today instead of waiting a day or two? How much of it is just because I feel to do it right now, which is very clean? How much of it is, what will the neighbors think if I let the lawn go another day, right? How much of it is guilt? If you really look to see why you're doing things, you can find the answer to that. And if you don't know the answer to that, you don't know if you're being driven by ego or spirit. The only way to know is to look. So the ego is seldom aware of the underlying beliefs that seem to drive all of its reactions and everything it does. This is why you must slow down and ask yourself why. And you must continue to ask why until you understand the nature of your reason, until you know whether that's egoic reasoning or right reasoning. All right, let's look briefly at the Holy Spirit or right reasoning. The Holy Spirit is love. And these are the characteristics of love. The first is peace. So when you feel at peace with whatever you are doing, then you are being moved by spirit. So it's just like, hey, think I'll go mow the lawn. You're mowing the lawn. You feel great about it. There's no stress. There's no burden. There's no, resentment, right? It's just peace. You're mowing the lawn with spirit. Acceptance. When you're in acceptance of what is, right? That's spirit. Joy. When you are happy, that is spirit. Recognition or remembrance. When you realize the truth, that is spirit. and always the purpose of one. When you are not seen with division, when you are seeing everyone and everything as being the same as you, as equal to you, that is spirit. So again, the characteristics of love or the characteristics of spirit are these: peace, acceptance, joy, recognition or remembrance, and always the purpose of one. In addition, willingness to follow spirit, willingness for spiritual practice, willingness to know the truth, that comes from right reason. Trusting things as they are, trusting that all is well, trusting that you will be taken care of. All forms of trust is right reason. Remember, the ego is fear. Spirit is trust. You can see how they're not the same thing, right? You can't be in fear and in trust at the same time. You're either in fear, in ego, or you are in trust, in spirit. Also, faith that even though you can't understand what you see out there in the world, that somehow the plan of love is in action. You don't have to understand it, you just trust it. Although you can't know how, you trust that all is well and happening perfectly. You desire only the highest good for all. You're not wishing something bad would happen to somebody else, right? That would be the ego. Spirit trusts your worth, right? You no longer see yourself as unworthy, less than. You trust your worth. And you also trust the hands you're in. You trust the divine, right? You trust that it has your back, that it's in control, that it's taking care of everything. It trusts your worth and the hands you are in. It is willing to let go and let God. So surrender. Surrender is a characteristic of right reason. Also, any action you take does not fight for a desired outcome. You're just doing things because you feel to do them. You're not trying to make something specific happen. It's just an action of now. This is what I feel to do now. And it's in faith and trust with everything else given to God. What comes of this is from God. So those are the characteristics of the ego and the characteristics of right reason. And again, if you pay attention, if you look, if you ask, why do I want to do this thing? What's motivating me now? You can discover for yourself whether you're being moved by ego or being moved by spirit. And only after you know whether you're being moved by ego or moved by spirit can you really make an effective decision. If you want truth, if you want awakening, the effective decision is to always see ego as meaningless and to always follow spirit, right? So you have to know which one you're listening to before you can make an effective decision. When we got to Acts chapter 20, it talked about the second stage of the spiritual path. As a whole, NTI actually talks about 4 different stages of the spiritual path. Last week, at the end of last week, we read about the first stage, which is the search. It's when something comes up in you where you start searching for truth. And, in the beginning, you may even be looking in the wrong direction, in the direction of some egoic religion or something. But that calling to find is beginning, and you're listening to teachers, you're reading books, you're asking questions, you're exploring. But what's happening when you're in the search phase is something else is beginning to happen. The way you've always thought before is beginning to be loosened. As you start reading these new perspectives and hearing these new perspectives from teachers, you start questioning the way you've always thought. And it's kind of like loosening the concrete of the way you've routinely thought. And when a certain amount of loosening has occurred, then you enter into the second phase, which is what NTI Acts chapter 20 is about, which is the letting go. This is when you're really looking at a thought, for example, you're noticing it's an egoic thought, and regardless of how loud it is, regardless of how much other people may think that's what you should do, for example, you're finding in yourself that you just want to let that go. You want to not be interested in that. You want to see that as meaningless because it's ego, and you no longer want ego. This is letting go. Letting go is losing interest in, not wanting that anymore, right? Wanting differently. So this is chapter 20, NTI Acts chapter 20, the letting go phase. Now, the third phase of the spiritual path, which we also read about this week. Let me see which chapter that was. That was Acts chapter 22. The third stage of the spiritual path is service. Service is when you have done enough letting go now of your old ways of thinking that you're no longer as invested in self-will as you once were. Remember, being invested in self-will is the ego. And so since you are no longer as invested in self-will as you used to be, you're now really ready to listen to right reason, to intuition. And you're really ready to do what it says. And so you can enter into service of the truth. And NTI Acts chapter 22 says, this is when the merging will occur. What that means is the sense that you are a separate individual will begin to shrink, to disappear, to die. And this realization that you're one with all things will begin to bloom, blossom, and come to light. So it's not a true merging. It's not like the separate self-will is merging into the light. It's the shrinking of the idea that you're separate and the blossoming of the realization that you are one. And that occurs through service, which is listening to right reason and coming to see that is me, not this egoic voice that I thought was me before, right? This is me. I can tell this is me. This is my heart. So the third stage on the path is the stage of guidance or service. This is the time when the merging will occur. And two things that are really going to be needed, which both are characteristics of right reason, for this merging to occur is a sense of acceptance instead of judging and wishing things were different, accepting things as they are, and surrender, right? Surrendering to what seems to be in the beginning a will other than your own, right? It's the letting go of self-will and surrendering into spiritual intuition. And you'll need willingness for this phase as well, which again is another characteristic of right reason. You'll need willingness to let go of your self-will. And you can expect the ego to fight you on this. You can expect sometimes a very loud ego that really wants you to continue to cling to self-will. But at some point, you will be ready, if you aren't already, to truly lay that self-will aside and to listen to the right reason instead and to live by that. It'll be what you want, right? And this is when you're really going to begin to make some incredible progress away from the sense of separation and into the realization of oneness or unity consciousness. This is how the merging occurs. It is through your own willingness to surrender to me. As you see more evidence that you have surrendered to peace, you willingly surrender. You willingly give more to me. So it's through the path of surrender that you begin to have faith in surrender, trust surrender, and surrender more, right? So you learn by doing. And it also says again in chapter 23, which we saw earlier in Acts chapter 19, you got to be questioning your reason here, right? You got to be looking, why do I want to do this? Am I trying to manipulate for an outcome that I think serves me? That's not surrender, right? There, I'm listening to the ego. Or is this really just, I feel something to do? I'm even a little afraid to do it. There's resistance to do it, but there's just this knowing that's what I am to do. And I choose to trust this, right? Trusting is a characteristic of Holy Spirit. I choose to trust this and do this anyway. Then you're surrendering. Then you're following right reason. When I skipped over to 23 from 20, I saw that I skipped some highlights. Let me go back and look at these highlights that I skipped. Oh, here at the end of, well, here in the middle of chapter 20, Gosh, there's a lot in chapter 20. Let me go back to chapter 20. By the way, I did say there were 4 phases. We'll learn about the 4th phase when we get to Corinthians. And that's really what a lot of people would call enlightenment. But we're learning about 3 phases here in Acts. The search, which is when the loosening occurs. The path of purification, or the letting go period, where you're letting go of thoughts. And service or guidance, which is when the merging occurs. So chapter 20 says, there is a part of you that is willing for God's will, and a part of you that is not. The part of you that is not is the voice of self-will. And that voice does not want to let go of the self. So again, I mentioned that a moment ago. You can expect the ego to speak up and to try and get you to care about me, worry about me, want the outcome that's best for me, manipulate for me, right? You can expect that. And that's the ego. You want to realize that's the ego. Again, trying to regain command and control, and do your best not to believe that voice, just to see it as meaningless, to see it as the ego, to realize that's not what you want anymore. It says, you must have faith in me, which is spirit or right reason, above everything you see, hear, and experience in the world. We were told that in NTI Matthew also, back in NTI Matthew chapter 13. This is to put true will above that of illusion. And then the Holy Spirit, or inner intuition, says, until the time when you do not need me, I am with you, guiding you, holding you. I am your connection to truth. For as long as you still see yourself as a separate person, you do have access to the spiritual intuition, which is like a bridge from the idea that you're a separate person into the realization of what you really are. Once the realization of what you really are awakens, you no longer need that bridge of spiritual intuition. You'll find the doing just happens from the right mind, right? The speaking just happens from the right mind. But when you think you're an individual person, you kind of have to ask or feel, because the ego is actually still your primary voice. And if you aren't taking the time to pause, to ask, to feel, what am I to do now? How am I to see this, right? You're just going to listen to the ego by default, because you aren't truly identified with your true self. You don't see that as yourself. So this intuition, the spiritual intuition, is a bridge, and it's needed. It is necessary, as long as you still identify as a separate person. So until the time when you do not need me, I am with you, guiding you and holding you. I am your connection to truth. NTI Acts chapter 21, again, talks about your reasoning, because it could be egoic reasoning or it could be right reason. It says your reason, as we have already discussed, is important on this path with me. It is a straight path with the opportunity for detours. All detours equal delay. Questioning your reasoning will help to reduce delay. Why do I want to do this? Why do I want to say this? Oh, I'm afraid of what he thinks of me, and I want to try and get him to see me the way I want him to see me. Well, that's ego. Well, then I don't need to do this. I don't need to say this, right? Looking, finding out, is this coming from ego, or is this just right reason? I used to call right reason a clean prompt. It didn't have the baggage of ego. But remember also, there's acceptance there, there's peace there, there's willingness there, there's trust there, right? You can find these characteristics when you're in right reason. Whenever you are tempted to do anything, question whether it is a temptation from the ego or prompt from spiritual intuition. Temptation comes from fear, the ego, and the desire for self-will, which are really all the same thing. A prompt is given by the Holy Spirit through your willingness to listen to him or it. You must be willing to look at the thoughts in your mind. You have to question them, right? If you don't do that work, you're probably just going to continue to be a robot or a puppet to the ego. And again, there was a lot in the reading this week about how you may be afraid to look. You need to look anyway. You need to realize fear comes from the ego. So when you're afraid to look at your thoughts and question your reasoning, it's like being tied as a slave or a robot to the ego. You're not even questioning it anymore. It's like the ego is using fear to keep you tied to it. So you can't let the fear of looking at your thoughts keep you from looking at your thoughts and questioning them. Acts chapter 22, we looked at that already. Acts chapter 23 says, as you walk the path with me, things will not seem to get easier. They may seem to get very, very tough. It says the reason for that is because there's this wish for cruelty in your mind. Sometimes this is referred to as darkness. And this darkness is heavily denied. And when the darkness starts coming up, to be looked at, to be seen as ego, to be let go, right? Let go is no longer a wish that we hold on to. That doesn't always, in fact, almost never feels pleasant. It can be a very unpleasant experience. I'm sure you've heard it called the dark night of the soul. And, some of you may say, I don't know if I have this wish for cruelty in me. I mean, this just is not ringing a bell. I don't resonate with that. Remember, it says it's heavily denied. So let me show something to you. This is actually an article in Psychology Today. It's not a spiritual article, but it's about cruelty. And I think it sheds some light on what this wish for cruelty might look like. So I'm going to share my screen. The name of this article is The True Cause of Cruelty. It's by Alex Lickerman, MD. Looks like it may have come from a book called Happiness in This World. The True Cause of Cruelty, the real reason people are cruel to one another. He talks about how children can be so cruel. In 7th grade, I once found myself in a school gym locker room changing before class when a group of my classmates began bullying a boy named Pino for having breasts, right? And we all know that children can be cruel. It's kind of interesting. We're saying this wish for cruelty is in us, and yet we see how early children begin to act out that cruelty. That might kind of show that maybe there's something to that, even though I want to say, hey, I'm not cruel. I'm a nice person, right? In fact, he says it's commonly observed how children can be mean to one another in a certain phase of their development. And what he says the true cause of cruelty is the spirit of abstraction. What is that? The spirit of abstraction. He says it's a term originally coined by Gabriel Marcel in his essay, The Spirit of Abstraction as a Factor Making for War. He says the spirit of abstraction is defined as the practice of conceiving people as functions rather than as human beings. So what does that mean? Well, in early American history, the African Americans were often just seen as slaves, which reduced their identity as human beings into this abstract idea only. They're my slaves, right? He also talks about how Hitler convinced a majority of Germans to conceive of a segment of their population as Jews. And also in the Second World War, Japanese people were seen as Japs, right? We may see people today as white supremacists. We may see people as fundamentalist Christians. We may see people as homeless. I mean, there's all kinds of abstractions we can use to not see people as they are, but to see people in this abstract, conceptual way. He says, when George H. Bush announced the beginning of the first Gulf War in 1990, a cheer was reported at a professional basketball game. And I remember thinking that even if a war were deemed necessary, how barbarous it was to enter into it with anything other than a heavy heart. That's what the Tao Te Ching says too. It talks about how war may sometimes be necessary, but it says you should go into it as if you're going into a funeral, right? So when people are, yay, those Muslims, let's go kill those Muslims, right? It's this spirit of abstraction, the spirit of abstraction. He even gives the example, today there are telemarketers at whom we snap and upon whom we hang up angrily for calling us at home. So the spirit of abstraction is something that I would call the spirit of separation. This is the wish for cruelty. This is the wish for cruelty. The spirit of wanting to see a me or an us and a them. That's the wish that lives in us. The spirit of abstraction, the spirit of separation, conceptual separation, is the wish for cruelty. If you want to read more about that article, again, that was The True Cause of Cruelty. You can find that online. Just type that in. And again, the author's name is Alex Lickerman, MD. So let's go back to NTI. When you look at the world, you see cruelty. The cruelty you see as separate from you. They're cruel, right? The Muslims are cruel, right? Yet if you are honest, you know that the cruelty lives in you as a wish. It is important to note that the cruelty is a wish, for a wish is not what you are. A wish is what you are not. In order to see beyond the wish that you made, you must take away the wish. We have to take away that desire that we have in ourselves to see others as separate from me, as different from me. In order to see beyond the wish that you made, you must take away the wish. This is why, as you walk this path with me, things may seem to get very tough. I am showing you the wish that you made, so you may choose to let go of the wish. Because you fear your wish, there is something you will unconsciously do. And this is important to listen to, because if we know we're going to unconsciously do this, we can catch ourselves doing it and we can correct. Because you fear your wish, there's something you will unconsciously do. Without realizing that you are doing it, you will give all that you have to avoid facing your wish. You will struggle more than you know to keep yourself in denial. But to stay in denial is to keep the wish. Denial is not what you want. And you can, if you really want to know the truth, if you really want unity consciousness, you can catch yourself in your own lies. It is possible. It comes from willingness. Remember, willingness is a characteristic of spirit. So when you're in willingness, you can actually see with spirit. And that enables you to catch yourself in your own lies. So it's not impossible. It's just a matter of how much you want truth. Denial is delay, right? To continue to deny this wish in you is to continue to delay your own awakening. Avoidance is to delay. Even peace and happiness in a world of fear is delay in giving up your wish. Peace and happiness in a world of fear is really kind of feeling like you got things under control. You're getting things your way, right? It's being a successful ego, but still ego, right? Still ego. It's fragile. Things never stay the way you want them. So it's very, very fragile. And even that, thinking, okay, I got this, even that is delay in awakening. Be not fooled by yourself. You want very much to be healed. You must face that which makes you sick. The ego is sick as compared to spirit. Mentally ill is what this means. You must face that which makes you sick. Accept it as given by your own wish and choose not to be sick anymore. NTI Acts chapter 24. Do not be afraid to face your accusers, right? Do not avoid. By accusers, the mind may tell us, oh, this person doesn't like me. I'm going to avoid seeing her, right? Don't avoid seeing her, right? Don't just let her say what she has to say, assuming she's even going to say it. Your mind's making it up anyway. But if she is, let her say what she's going to say. Do not be afraid to face your accusers. Do not be afraid of pain. In fact, look forward to the opportunity to see what you have wished. You're seeing separation in action, knowing that what is wished that is not true. Right? This is a playing out of the wish for separation. It's a play, like we heard in the audio. It's a playing out of the wish for separation. Know that when you face your wish, it may not at all seem easy. You're going to have to cling to spirit, cling to trust, cling to willingness. This is because the root of belief makes your wish seem real to you. When you face that which you fear, there is one thing you must remember. What you look on is not at all real, and you face it to deny it. Now, we talked about, we want to take it out of denial. So what does this mean when you face it to deny it? Just to deny that this is the truth, to deny that this is what I want. So when I'm facing my accuser and she's, maybe telling me how awful I am in whatever way she is, I look at this. I feel that pain of that unworthiness. I look at what's going on in my mind. I say, all of this is the wish for separation. This is what I'm experiencing right now. I'm experiencing that sense of separation. Is this what I want? Do I want to continue to experience this, or do I want to see with unity consciousness? No, I don't want to continue to experience this. I want to learn to let go of ego in my own mind. I want to learn to follow that spiritual intuition instead. See, that's the type of denial. That's the right use of denial. I'm denying, I don't want that anymore, by looking at it, not by being afraid to look at it. I'm looking right at it and saying, oh my God, was I crazy? Why would I want all of this yucky feeling? Why would I want all of this fear, this guilt, this unworthiness, this attack, this defense, this blame, control, lack of control? That's not what I want, right? So when you look, what you look on is not at all real, and you face it to deny it. When you deny what seems real, you are only being truthful, for it has no reality at all. Grab on to me as your courage, hold tight to your faith, and trust that your belief is wrong. Your belief in separation is wrong. Your belief that you are unworthy is wrong. Your belief that there is something to fear is wrong. Your belief that you have to control this is wrong. Trust that your belief is wrong. Know that you will not face your wish fully until you're fully ready to see, right? This comes from your willingness, from your right mind. Remember your freedom. Nothing can be given you that you are not willing to receive. So if this yuckiness starts coming up, this is a good sign. This means that your willingness is helping to flush that out so you can let it go. I will be with you, strengthening you according to your willingness, walking towards the wish that you do want to see. And we have a little bit more of Acts to go through, and then we're going to begin NTI Romans. And NTI Romans is going to take us in to look even more at this wish. So it's exciting. It's good to be here with you. And I'll see you next week. Bye.